Imagine a priest standing at the altar, finishing his sermon with the words "Heil Hitler," as his congregation raises their arms in the Nazi salute. Now picture another priest, just miles away, being beaten and tortured in a concentration camp for refusing to pledge allegiance to the same man. This was the reality of the Catholic Church during Hitler's reign, a house divided against itself. Some clergymen became willing participants in one of history's darkest chapters, while others chose martyrdom over compromise. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about how the Third Reich infiltrated the sacred halls of Christianity, and how an invisible war was fought within the very institution meant to stand for peace and love. In 1933, as Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, the Catholic Church faced an unprecedented dilemma. For centuries, the Vatican had been a moral authority, a political entity, and the spiritual home to millions of Germans. Pope Pius X watched anxiously from Rome as the new chancellor consolidated power with alarming speed. The Church had initially opposed the Nazi Party, placing it on a list of organizations Catholics were forbidden to join. But Hitler was smart. He knew that to control the German people completely, he needed the Church's cooperation, not its condemnation. What followed was one of the most controversial religious negotiations in modern history. The Reichskonkordat, a treaty between Nazi Germany and the Vatican that would set the stage for years of moral compromise. The agreement promised to protect Catholic rights in Germany in exchange for the Church's political neutrality. On paper, it seemed like a necessary compromise to protect the faithful. In reality, it became the first step in a systematic program to either convert or crush religious authority. As the treaty was signed, Catholics across Germany breathed a sigh of relief, believing their churches would remain safe. They couldn't have been more wrong. Within months, Hitler began violating the agreement, closing Catholic schools and youth groups, arresting priests who spoke against the regime, and replacing Christian teachings with Nazi ideology. The Church found itself trapped by its own diplomatic efforts, unable to protest without endangering German Catholics, and unwilling to confront the monster it had inadvertently helped legitimize. Meanwhile, in parishes across the Reich, a division began forming between clergy and congregations. Some priests, particularly those with nationalistic tendencies, saw Hitler as Germany's savior from the humiliation of World War I and the threat of communism. They incorporated Nazi symbols into church services, preached sermons supporting racial purity, and encouraged their flocks to embrace the new regime as God's will for Germany. These men didn't see themselves as betraying their faith. In their minds, they were simply being patriotic Germans, while also serving as men of God. This self-deception allowed hundreds of clergymen to participate in what would become one of history's greatest moral failures. But not all men of the cloth followed this path. Across Germany and occupied territories, a resistance was forming within church walls. Brave priests and bishops risked everything to speak truth to power, hiding Jews in monasteries and church basements, distributing anti-Nazi literature, and refusing to preach the gospel of Aryan supremacy. For these acts of courage, they would pay dearly. By 1939, over 3,000 Catholic priests had been imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp alone, where they were subjected to some of the most brutal experiments and treatments in the entire camp system. The stage was set for a spiritual battle that would test the very soul of Christianity. The seeds of this religious conflict were planted long before Hitler took power. The Great War had left Germany broken, humiliated, and searching for someone to blame. Many Catholic communities, especially in Bavaria and rural areas, embraced the narrative that Jews, liberals, and communists had stabbed Germany in the back. When a charismatic Austrian corporal began promising to restore German greatness, these communities were receptive. By the time Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius X, was dispatched to Germany as papal nuncio in 1920, he found a Catholic population already flirting with nationalist extremism. Pacelli, who would later be criticized for his silence during the Holocaust, spent 13 years in Germany, witnessing firsthand the rise of the movement that would ultimately test his moral courage. As Hitler consolidated power, he implemented a strategy called Gleichschaltung, coordination or synchronization, designed to bring every aspect of German society under Nazi control. churches were not exempt. Hitler created a Reich Church ministry headed by Hans Kerrl, tasked with bringing all religious denominations into line with Nazi ideology. For Catholics, this meant a systematic campaign to weaken their connection to Rome and strengthen their loyalty to Berlin. Priests were monitored by the Gestapo, with informants often sitting in church pews to report any anti-Nazi sentiments expressed during homilies. Religious publications were censored, Catholic schools were gradually closed or taken over, and religious holidays were replaced with Nazi celebrations. For many parish priests, the pressure was unbearable. Cooperate or watch your congregation suffer. The situation became particularly dire in Poland, where 90% of the population was Catholic. When German forces invaded in 1939, they targeted Polish clergy with particular brutality, understanding that priests served as community leaders who could potentially organize resistance. In the first 4 months of occupation alone, over 700 priests were executed and thousands more were sent to concentration camps. The Nazis systematically closed seminaries, confiscated church property, and restricted religious services. Their goal was clear: to decapitate the Polish Catholic Church and replace it with a compliant German-controlled institution. Yet even in this darkness, some priests chose to stand firm, conducting clandestine masses in forests and basements, secretly baptizing children, and providing spiritual comfort to a population under siege. Back in Germany, Catholics faced daily moral quandaries. Should a devout mother send her children to Hitler Youth as required by law, knowing they would be indoctrinated with ideologies contrary to her faith? Could a Catholic businessman refuse to fire his Jewish employees without risking his own family's safety? Could a priest speak truth from the pulpit when a single sermon could mean deportation to Dachau? These were not abstract theological debates, but urgent daily decisions. Many chose the path of least resistance, making small compromises that gradually eroded their moral boundaries. Others found subtle ways to resist, adding prayers for those who suffer, a coded reference to Jews and political prisoners, omitting the required Heil Hitler at the beginning of sermons, or teaching traditional Catholic doctrine in ways that subtly contradicted Nazi racial theories. As the war expanded across Europe, so did this spiritual battlefield. In occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Catholic clergy played crucial roles in resistance movements. In Italy, monasteries and convents became havens for Jews after the German occupation in 1943. Yet for every heroic priest who risked execution to hide a Jewish family, there were others who blessed Nazi troops heading to the Eastern Front or refused to speak against the disappearance of their Jewish neighbors. This inconsistency reflected the Vatican's own ambiguous position, condemning racism and totalitarianism in principle through encyclicals like Mit brennender Sorge, while maintaining diplomatic relations with the Nazi regime, and rarely making specific public denouncements of atrocities. By 1941, as the final solution moved from concept to horrific reality, the division within the Catholic clergy became impossible to ignore. Some priests were actively participating in the regime, like Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest who became president of the Nazi puppet state of Slovakia and willingly deported 70,000 Jews to death camps. Others, like Bernhard Lichtenberg, the provost of Berlin's St. Hedwig's Cathedral, prayed publicly for Jews and concentration camp inmates each evening, knowing it would lead to his arrest. When ordered to stop these prayers, Lichtenberg responded, "I will continue to preach the gospel, even if it costs me my life." His defiance earned him a 2-year prison sentence, followed by transfer to Dachau. He died en route to the camp in 1943. These two men, both ordained in the same church, represented the extremes of a moral spectrum along which thousands of Catholic clergy positioned themselves. The creation of the priest barracks at Dachau concentration camp stands as one of the most striking examples of the Nazi regime's complex relationship with Catholicism. Block 26, specifically designated for imprisoned clergy, held over 2,000 Catholic priests at various times during the war. Unlike other prisoners, priests were initially allowed to have a chapel and conduct mass, a bizarre concession that revealed Hitler's reluctance to completely antagonize the church. Yet these same priests endured brutal medical experiments, starvation rations, and forced labor. Polish priests were treated with particular cruelty, receiving harsher punishments and fewer privileges than their German counterparts, a stark reminder that even in persecution, Nazi racial hierarchy remained in force. The camp became a microcosm of the broader Catholic experience under Nazism, suffering alongside other victims while simultaneously navigating internal divisions based on nationality and political stance. In the Vatican, Pope Pius V walked a diplomatic tightrope. Having served as papal nuncio to Germany, and then as Vatican Secretary of State, he knew the Nazi leadership personally and understood the regime's brutality. After becoming pope in 1939, he drafted an encyclical condemning racism and anti-Semitism, but ultimately shelved it, fearing it would worsen conditions for Catholics under Nazi rule. Instead, he chose quiet diplomacy and behind-the-scenes assistance. Vatican radio broadcasts condemned atrocities without naming perpetrators. Papal representatives in countries like Hungary and Romania issued baptismal certificates to Jews to protect them from deportation. The Pope himself ordered Vatican properties to shelter thousands of Jews during the German occupation of Rome. Yet his public silence, particularly his failure to explicitly condemn the Holocaust, remains one of the most controversial aspects of Catholic history. Was this prudent protection of the faithful or a moral failure at a critical moment? This debate continues to divide historians today. The strain of living under constant scrutiny took its toll on ordinary parish priests. Many developed coded languages to communicate with their congregations, subtly undermining Nazi ideology while avoiding direct confrontation. When forced to display swastikas in their churches, some positioned them near images of the devil in stained glass windows or church art, a silent protest understood by parishioners, but difficult for authorities to punish. In confessionals, priests heard the moral dilemmas of soldiers returning from the Eastern Front who had witnessed or participated in mass killings. Some priests offered absolution, coupled with encouragement to resist further participation. Others emphasized obedience to legitimate authority as a Catholic virtue. These intimate spiritual interactions rarely left historical records, but shaped countless individual decisions during the war's darkest hours. As Allied bombs fell on German cities by 1944, the regime that had sought to control religion found itself increasingly reliant on religious comfort. Air raid shelters filled with people praying rosaries. Soldiers on doomed fronts sought last rites from military chaplains. The same Nazi officials who had closed monasteries now tacitly allowed priests to minister to civilian populations experiencing unprecedented suffering. This resurgence of religious practice amid national catastrophe represented both a failure of the Nazi project to replace Christianity with state ideology and a testament to the resilience of faith in crisis. Yet even in these final months, the Church remained divided. While some priests joined the last-ditch resistance against Hitler, others continued to preach about the religious duty to defend the fatherland until the very end, blessing teenage boys as they were sent to die in a lost war. The moral complexity of the Catholic response to Nazism is perhaps best illustrated by the story of Clemens August Graf von Galen, the Bishop of Münster. Known as the Lion of Münster, von Galen delivered 3 fiery sermons in 1941 denouncing the Nazi euthanasia program, which had secretly ordered the killing of disabled Germans. Standing tall in his cathedral, the aristocratic bishop thundered, "If you establish and apply the principle that you can kill unproductive fellow human beings, then woe to all of us when we become old and frail." His sermons were secretly copied and distributed throughout Germany, and even read by Allied pilots over German cities. Hitler was furious, but hesitant to arrest such a prominent church leader, fearing public backlash. The euthanasia program was temporarily halted, a rare Nazi retreat in response to moral opposition. Yet this same courageous bishop never publicly condemned the deportation of Jews, illustrating how even the most vocal Catholic critics of Nazism often had moral blind spots shaped by centuries of religious anti-Semitism. Deep within occupied territories, some priests took even more direct action, joining armed resistance movements despite Catholic teaching that traditionally limited clerical involvement in violence. In France, priests like Père Pierre joined the Maquis resistance fighters, sometimes even participating in sabotage operations while wearing their clerical collars under civilian clothes. In Poland, some clergy provided sacraments and spiritual guidance to the Home Army resistance. These priests justified their actions as defense of the innocent against an immoral regime, viewing resistance not as politics but as Christian duty. Yet for every priest who joined the resistance, many others advised their parishioners to accommodate the occupation, arguing that premature resistance would only bring reprisals against civilians. This tension between active resistance and passive endurance created rifts within Catholic communities that would last long after the war ended. The Holocaust presented Catholic clergy with their most profound moral test. By 1942, reports of mass killings of Jews had reached church authorities through various channels, including priests in occupied territories. Some clergy responded with extraordinary courage. In Assisi, Italy, Father Rufino Nicacci orchestrated a network that hid over 300 Jews in monasteries and convents. In France, Cardinal Pierre-Marie Gerlier of Lyon issued false baptismal certificates to Jewish children. In Hungary, Papal Nuncio Angelo Rota distributed thousands of protective passes to Jews facing deportation, but these heroic examples existed alongside failures of moral courage. Many priests remained silent as their Jewish neighbors disappeared. Some repeated anti-Semitic tropes from their pulpits or distinguished between opposing the killing of Jews, which they condemned, and supporting laws restricting Jewish participation in society, which many accepted. The Church's centuries-old ambivalence toward Judaism created a moral fog in which even well-intentioned clergy sometimes lost their ethical bearings. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces from the west, the Catholic Church in Nazi-controlled territories faced a new threat: Soviet communism. For many Catholic leaders, particularly those from Eastern European countries, this approaching threat seemed as dangerous as Nazism itself. This fear complicated their response in the final war years. Some bishops who had maintained silence during Nazi atrocities suddenly found their voice to warn against the atheistic Soviet threat. Others made pragmatic accommodations with retreating Nazi authorities, hoping to preserve church infrastructure for the coming ideological battle against communism. This strategic positioning for the post-war era sometimes came at the expense of moral clarity about Nazi crimes still in progress. Yet it would be unfair to view these decisions only through hindsight. Clergy in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and other Eastern territories had legitimate reasons to fear Soviet rule, which had already demonstrated its hostility to religion during pre-war persecutions. Within concentration camps, Catholic priests created one of the war's most unexpected testimonies to faith. In Dachau, imprisoned clergy established a clandestine seminary to ordain new priests, perhaps the only ordinations ever performed inside a Nazi death camp. In Auschwitz, Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan friar, volunteered to take the place of a Jewish prisoner condemned to death by starvation, saying, "I am a Catholic priest. I would like to take his place because he has a wife and children." After 2 weeks without food or water, when Kolbe still showed signs of life, guards killed him with a lethal injection on August 14, 1941. His extraordinary sacrifice represented the highest expression of Catholic resistance to Nazi inhumanity, not through political opposition, but through radical, self-giving love in the darkest place on earth. Yet even as some priests made the ultimate sacrifice, others serving as camp chaplains for SS guards continued to provide sacraments to men directly involved in mass murder. The most controversial Catholic response to Nazi persecution came from the very top of the church hierarchy. Pope Pius XIII, often called Hitler's Pope by critics and righteous Gentile by defenders, embodied the church's paradoxical position. Born Eugenio Pacelli, he had served as Vatican Secretary of State before becoming Pope in 1939, negotiating the Reichskonkordat with Nazi Germany. As Pope during the Holocaust, he never issued a clear public condemnation specifically naming the Nazi regime or the genocide of Jews, despite receiving detailed reports of mass killings from various Catholic sources. His Christmas messages during the war contained only oblique references to those who suffered because of their nationality or race. This public silence has been interpreted by some historians as moral failure or even tacit approval, while others argue it reflected a calculated strategy to avoid worse persecution of Catholics and to maintain Vatican neutrality for humanitarian work. What's undeniable is that under his leadership, Vatican properties sheltered thousands of Jews during the German occupation of Rome in 1943, and diplomatic representatives of the Holy See in countries like Hungary and Romania saved many Jewish lives through baptismal certificates and Vatican protection documents. Far from the marble halls of the Vatican, ordinary parish priests faced impossible choices daily. Consider Father Josef Müller from Bavaria, who joined the anti-Nazi resistance and served as a courier between German military intelligence officers planning to overthrow Hitler and the Vatican. Arrested by the Gestapo in 1943, he endured months of torture without revealing his contacts before being sent to Dachau. Or Father Alfred Delp, a Jesuit who participated in the Kreisau Circle resistance group, drafting plans for a Christian democratic Germany after Hitler. Arrested after the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, Delp was hung from a meat hook with his arms shackled behind him until his shoulders dislocated, standard Gestapo procedure. Yet even under torture, he managed to smuggle out theological reflections written in handcuffs that remain spiritual classics today. When offered freedom in exchange for leaving the Jesuit order, Delp refused and was hanged on February 2, 1945. These priests represent a tradition of resistance that challenges the narrative of Catholic accommodation with Nazism. In German-occupied Poland, where the Church faced its most severe persecution outside of Germany itself, the story of Maximilian Kolbe exemplified both the heights of Catholic heroism and the complexity of the Church's position. Before his martyrdom in Auschwitz, Father Kolbe had founded a massive Franciscan monastery complex called Niepokalanów, which published religious materials, including some with anti-Semitic content typical of Polish Catholicism in that era. Yet when war came, this same priest hid approximately 2,000 Jews in his monastery and produced underground publications opposing Nazi occupation. His journey from participating in traditional Catholic anti-Semitism to giving his life for a Jewish prisoner illustrates the potential for moral growth, even within problematic religious traditions. This transformation was not unique to Kolbe. Many Catholics who helped Jews during the Holocaust did so despite, rather than because of, their pre-war religious education about Judaism. The Church's internal divisions were perhaps most visible in the different responses of monasteries and convents across occupied Europe. Some religious communities became centers of rescue operations for Jews and other persecuted groups. The Cistercian monastery at Hautecom in France hid resistance fighters and Jews throughout the war. Sisters of Notre Dame de Sion, an order originally founded to convert Jews to Catholicism, instead used their networks to hide Jewish children in convents across France. Yet other religious houses refused to open their doors to those fleeing persecution or even denounced hidden Jews to authorities. This stark contrast often depended on the moral courage of individual abbots, abbesses, or priors rather than official church policy. Religious vows of obedience created additional complexity. Some priests and nuns felt bound to follow their superiors' directives, even when those orders conflicted with their personal moral judgment about helping the persecuted. By 1944, as Germany faced inevitable defeat, some Catholic leaders began positioning themselves for the post-war era. Cardinal Konrad von Preysing of Berlin, one of the few consistent German episcopal critics of Nazism, established contact with Allied authorities through neutral countries. In France, clergy who had supported the Vichy regime suddenly discovered their resistance credentials as liberation approached. In Italy, after Mussolini's fall, the Vatican increased its efforts to present the Church as a victim of fascism rather than a collaborator. This historical revisionism began even before the war ended and would shape Catholic memory of the Nazi era for decades. Yet alongside opportunism existed genuine efforts at moral reckoning. Some priests who had witnessed Nazi atrocities began collecting documentation of crimes even at personal risk, determined that the truth would eventually emerge. Others who had compromised their principles started the painful process of examining their own culpability, often through the sacrament of confession to fellow priests, private acts of contrition that rarely entered the historical record but were essential to post-war spiritual healing. As the war entered its final phase in 1945, a new moral conflict emerged within the Catholic clergy. Records from Dachau concentration camp reveal that, of the 2,720 clergy imprisoned there, an overwhelming 94% were Catholic priests. Of these, 1,748 were Polish, with more than 800 dying during their imprisonment. Despite these staggering numbers indicating widespread clerical resistance to Nazism, the Church's leadership faced a difficult reckoning. In the occupied territories, some priests had actively collaborated with Nazi authorities, seeing communism as the greater threat to the Church. In France, some bishops had openly supported the Vichy regime. In Croatia, the Ustasha movement, led by Ante Pavelić, received blessing from Catholic clergy despite implementing genocide against Orthodox Serbs, Jews and Roma. The same church that produced martyrs like Maximilian Kolbe had also produced collaborators like Joseph Tiso in Slovakia, who as both priest and president had authorized deportations of Jews to death camps. In Germany itself, many Catholic bishops and priests found themselves uncomfortably compromised. As Allied forces advanced, Church authorities rushed to hide or destroy evidence of complicity. Letters congratulating Hitler on surviving assassination attempts, pastoral letters urging Catholics to fulfill their patriotic duty to the Reich, prayer books for German soldiers that justified the war as a crusade against Bolshevism. Military chaplains had provided spiritual comfort to Wehrmacht soldiers participating in atrocities on the Eastern Front. According to research on Wehrmacht priests, hundreds of Catholic clergy had joined Nazi soldiers on the front lines of the war, offering spiritual guidance between 1939 and 1945, while thousands of church properties were converted into military hospitals, where tens of thousands of nuns worked as nurses. While these services could be interpreted as simple pastoral care for German Catholics, they inevitably provided moral and spiritual support for Hitler's war machine. Even as some priests rescued Jews, others remained silent about deportations or even facilitated the identification of Catholics of Jewish descent. The conflict was not merely between good Catholics and bad Catholics. It existed within individuals themselves. Many priests struggled with divided loyalties between their faith, their nation, and their personal safety. Consider Father Franz Schmidt from Bavaria. As documents later revealed, he had privately provided baptismal certificates to several Jewish families to protect them from deportation, while simultaneously giving public sermons emphasizing obedience to legitimate authority and praying for German victory. Or Father Johannes Neuhäusler, who as a church official had criticized Nazi racial policies and was imprisoned at Dachau from 1941, yet had earlier supported the Nazi invasion of Poland as a necessary defense against communism. These internal contradictions reflected the Church's own ambiguous position, condemning specific Nazi policies while seeking accommodation with the regime, opposing anti-Semitism in principle while harboring centuries of anti-Jewish theology, preaching universal human dignity while practicing national and ethnic particularism. The final months of the war saw desperate attempts by Nazi leaders to use religion as a last-ditch motivational tool. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, references to divine providence and religious duty increased in propaganda. Hitler himself, though privately contemptuous of Christianity, never formally left the Catholic Church and continued to use religious language when useful. Wehrmacht chaplains were instructed to emphasize themes of sacrifice and resurrection to troops facing certain defeat. Some priests complied, finding in Germany's impending destruction parallels to Christ's passion and promising eventual national redemption. Others, recognizing the regime's imminent collapse, began quietly establishing contact with Allied forces, positioning themselves as anti-Nazis who had merely been following orders under duress. This moral flexibility, adapting religious positions to shifting political winds, would become a controversial aspect of the Church's post-war narrative about its role during the Nazi era. As Soviet forces approached from the east and American and British forces from the west, the Vatican intensified its diplomatic efforts to position itself as a neutral humanitarian actor rather than a compromised institution. Through papal nuncios in various countries, the Holy See issued thousands of protective documents to Jews in Hungary and Romania. In Rome itself, Pope Pius XIV ordered church properties to shelter refugees, including Jews hiding from German occupiers. Yet these late humanitarian actions would later be criticized as too little. Too late. Gestures made when the outcome of the war was already clear rather than principled stands at the height of Nazi power. When American troops liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, they found hundreds of Catholic priests among the starving, diseased inmates, testament to both the clergy who had resisted Nazism and paid with their freedom or lives, and to the complex moral landscape of a church that had both opposed and accommodated the Third Reich. The surviving priests of Dachau would carry their experiences back to their parishes and dioceses across Europe, where they would face fellow clergy who had made very different choices during the Nazi years. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Catholic Church faced a moral reckoning unlike any in its modern history. As the full horror of the Holocaust emerged, Catholics across Europe struggled to understand how their spiritual leaders had responded to Nazi atrocities. Some survivors told stories of heroic priests and nuns who had hidden Jews at great personal risk. Others recounted clergy who had turned away when their Jewish neighbors disappeared or even facilitated Nazi crimes. In Rome, Pope Pius V maintained the diplomatic stance he had held throughout the war, neither explicitly condemning Nazi leadership nor acknowledging any institutional failures. This silence, which had been justified during the conflict as necessary to protect Catholics in occupied territories, now appeared to many as moral cowardice or even tacit approval. The Vatican's primary concern shifted to the new threat of Soviet communism spreading across Eastern Europe, where Catholic clergy were already facing persecution in countries falling behind the Iron Curtain. This rapid pivot from one perceived existential threat to another allowed little time for institutional soul-searching about recent moral compromises. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation of Catholic complicity came not during the war but afterward, when evidence emerged of what became known as the rat lines, escape networks that helped Nazi war criminals flee Europe, often to South America. Key figures in these networks included Catholic clergy, like Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, and Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic, who provided false documentation, shelter in church properties, and connections to sympathetic governments in Argentina and elsewhere. Hudal, who had published a book praising Hitler in 1937, continued to view Nazis not as perpetrators of genocide, but as anti-communist warriors deserving Christian mercy. Operating from Rome with apparent Vatican knowledge, Hudal and others helped notorious figures like Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and Franz Stangl escape justice. While these activities were never officially sanctioned by the Pope, they occurred within the Church's institutional structure and utilized its resources and diplomatic connections. The rat lines represented a final, profound moral failure. Rather than facilitating justice for victims, elements within the Church enabled perpetrators to evade accountability for crimes against humanity. For ordinary Catholics, especially in Germany and occupied territories, the post-war years brought painful personal reckonings. Many had to confront whether their own silence or compliance had contributed to Nazi crimes. The moral framework provided by their spiritual leaders had often emphasized obedience to authority, anti-communism, and national loyalty over universal human rights or solidarity with the persecuted. Those who had resisted, like the priests of Dachau or members of the White Rose movement, had often done so against the cautious guidance of the institutional church. In confession booths across Europe, priests heard the moral anguish of Catholics who had witnessed deportations, benefited from stolen Jewish property, or served in military units involved in atrocities. The traditional Catholic theology of sin and forgiveness, with its emphasis on individual confession and absolution, proved inadequate for addressing complicity in systemic evil. The Church, which had long positioned itself as society's moral authority, now struggled to provide guidance on how to process collective guilt. theologians within the Church began a painful reassessment of Catholic teaching about Judaism. For centuries, Catholic doctrine had characterized Jews as rejected by God, spiritually blind, or collectively responsible for Christ's death. These teachings had created fertile ground for Nazi anti-Semitism to take root, even among faithful Catholics. The Holocaust forced a confrontation with this theological anti-Semitism that would eventually lead to the Second Vatican Council's landmark declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965, which repudiated the charge of Jewish deicide and affirmed the continuing validity of God's covenant with the Jewish people. Yet this theological revolution came too late for the millions murdered, while Christian Europe largely stood by. Some Catholic thinkers, like the priest-philosopher Jacques Maritain, argued that the Holocaust represented not just a political crime, but a spiritual crisis for Christianity itself, a failure to recognize Christ in the suffering Jewish victims. Despite centuries of Christian teaching about seeing God in the oppressed, the divided legacy of Catholic responses to Nazism remains contested today. Modern church historians acknowledge both the institutional failures and individual heroism of Catholics during this dark period. They recognize figures like Bernhard Lichtenberg, the Berlin provost who publicly prayed for Jews and died en route to Dachau, Gertrude Luckner, the Catholic social worker who organized aid for persecuted Jews until her arrest in 1943, and the thousands of ordinary Catholics who followed their conscience rather than their compromised leaders. Yet they must also reckon with the church hierarchy's diplomatic caution, theological anti-Semitism, and post-war assistance to Nazi fugitives. This ambiguous legacy offers critical lessons about the dangers of institutional self-preservation, taking precedence over moral clarity, the risk of religious nationalism overwhelming universal ethical principles, and the possibility that even a 2,000-year-old moral tradition can fail catastrophically when confronted with novel forms of evil. The Catholic Church that emerged from World War II was both a community of martyrs and a compromised institution, a paradox that continues to shape its identity and witness in the modern world. The story of Father Alfred Delp illustrates the extraordinary courage shown by some Catholic clergy during the Nazi regime. A Jesuit priest who joined the anti-Nazi Kreisau Circle resistance group, Delp envisioned a post-Hitler Germany, guided by Christian social principles. Arrested after the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, he endured months of torture in Berlin's Tegel prison. His hands were kept shackled except during meals, yet he managed to smuggle out theological reflections written in his cell, passing the pages to visitors hidden in his laundry. These prison meditations, later published as Advent of the Heart, reveal a profound spirituality forged in extremity. When offered freedom if he would leave the Jesuit order, Delp refused, writing, "The real issue is whether there remains in a man's heart any corner in which God can speak." He was hanged on February 2, 1945, just months before Germany's surrender. Delp's witness stands in stark contrast to collaborationist priests who found theological justifications for supporting Hitler, a reminder that authentic Catholic faith demanded resistance rather than accommodation to Nazi ideology. While individual Catholic heroes like Delp have been rightfully celebrated, the Church's institutional response to Nazism reflects a more troubling pattern of prioritizing institutional survival over moral witness. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the German Catholic bishops quickly shifted from opposition to accommodation. They withdrew their previous condemnations of National Socialism and instructed Catholics to be loyal to the new government. The Vatican's Secretary of State, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius XV, negotiated the Reichskonkordat with Hitler's regime, granting legitimacy to the Nazi government in exchange for guarantees of church rights. Though Hitler would violate these guarantees almost immediately, the Concordat effectively neutralized potential Catholic opposition during Hitler's crucial consolidation of power. This pattern of institutional self-preservation would repeat throughout the Nazi era. Occasional protests against specific policies that directly affected Catholic interests, but rarely principled opposition to the regime's underlying ideology or its persecution of other groups. The Church's hierarchical structure, which demanded obedience to authority, made it particularly vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation by totalitarian regimes. The German bishops' complex relationship with Nazism became especially evident in their response to euthanasia programs targeting the disabled. When the Nazis began secretly killing mentally and physically disabled Germans in 1939, including Catholic patients in church-run hospitals, several bishops protested directly to the regime. Most notably, Clemens August von Galen, Bishop of Münster, delivered 3 powerful sermons in 1941 denouncing these killings as murder. His public stand temporarily halted the program and demonstrated that vocal church opposition could effectively challenge Nazi policies. Yet this moral clarity did not extend to the persecution of Jews. The same Bishop von Galen, who courageously defended disabled Germans, remained largely silent about the deportation of Jews from his diocese. This selective moral vision, seeing clearly the evil of killing disabled Catholics while overlooking the systematic destruction of European Jewry, characterized much of the institutional church's response to Nazism. It reflected both the Church's traditional concern for its own members above others and its centuries-old theological antisemitism, which had conditioned many Catholics to view Jews as outsiders deserving of marginalization. The war's impact on Catholic identity varied dramatically across Europe, shaped by local conditions and national histories. In Poland, where both Catholic clergy and laity suffered tremendously under Nazi occupation, the Church emerged from the war with enhanced moral authority as a symbol of national resistance. Nearly 2,000 Polish priests died in concentration camps, with the highest clergy mortality rate of any occupied country. This martyrdom strengthened Polish Catholicism's identification with national suffering and resistance to foreign domination. In France, by contrast, the Church faced difficult questions about its support for the collaborationist Vichy regime. Many French bishops had welcomed Marshal Pétain's national revolution with its emphasis on traditional values summarized in the slogan, "Work, Family, Fatherland." Though individual priests joined the resistance, the church hierarchy generally cooperated with Vichy authorities even as they implemented anti-Jewish measures. In Germany, the Catholic Church's ambiguous wartime record contributed to a post-war crisis of authority, with many Catholics questioning their leaders' moral judgment. In Italy, the Church successfully portrayed itself as having been an opponent of fascism, despite its earlier accommodation of Mussolini's regime. These divergent national experiences highlight the absence of a consistent Catholic response to fascism and Nazism. Rather than following clear moral principles derived from Catholic teaching, church leaders often made pragmatic decisions based on institutional interests and national loyalties. The traditional Catholic emphasis on hierarchy, obedience, and respect for legitimate authority proved dangerously inadequate when confronted with modern totalitarianism's demands for total allegiance. Yet the war years also revealed the profound spiritual resources within Catholicism that inspired remarkable acts of courage and compassion by individual believers. In the concentration camps, imprisoned priests created makeshift altars from stolen bread and wine to celebrate Mass secretly. Catholic families throughout occupied Europe hid Jewish children at great personal risk, motivated by gospel teachings about protecting the vulnerable. Polish nuns in Warsaw smuggled Jewish children out of the ghetto, providing them false baptismal certificates and safe haven in convents. These actions demonstrate that authentic Catholic faith transcended institutional compromises, that the Church as the people of God sometimes acted more faithfully than the Church as a hierarchical institution. This dual legacy of institutional failure and individual heroism has profoundly shaped Catholic self-understanding in the post-Holocaust world. The moral complexity of Catholic responses to Nazism is perhaps most evident in the figure of Pope Pius X. Born Eugenio Pacelli, he had served as Vatican Secretary of State and Papal Nuncio to Germany before becoming Pope in March 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II. His papacy coincided almost exactly with the war years, placing him at the center of the Church's most significant moral challenge of the 20th century. Defenders point to his Christmas messages condemning racism, his diplomatic efforts that saved thousands of Jewish lives in Rome during the German occupation, and his private instructions to bishops and nuncios to assist persecuted Jews. Critics highlight his failure to publicly condemn the Holocaust, his continued diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, and his post-war assistance to former Nazis escaping justice. Described alternately as Hitler's Pope or a righteous Gentile, Pius XV embodies the Church's wartime paradox, neither a villain nor a hero, but a cautious diplomat attempting to navigate unprecedented evil while preserving the Church's institutional position and capacity for humanitarian action. Recent opening of Vatican archives has revealed his detailed knowledge of the Holocaust through multiple sources, yet continued preference for quiet diplomacy over public condemnation. For Jewish survivors, the Church's wartime record created a profound theological challenge. Many Jews who had been hidden by Catholics during the war expressed immense gratitude to their rescuers, while questioning why such actions were exceptional rather than normative. The Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas, who lost many family members in the Holocaust, asked how Christians could read the Gospels for centuries, yet fail to recognize the moral imperative to protect the persecuted. For some Jewish thinkers, the Holocaust represented not just a failure of Christian institutions, but of Christian theology itself. The culmination of centuries of teaching that Jews were rejected by God, spiritually blind, and deserving of social marginalization. The rabbi and philosopher Emil Fackenheim argued that any post-Holocaust Christian theology must acknowledge how traditional Christian supersessionism, the belief that the Church replaced Israel as God's chosen people, had contributed to European anti-Semitism. These Jewish critiques pushed the Catholic Church toward a profound theological re-examination that would eventually find expression in the Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate, which repudiated anti-Semitism and affirmed God's enduring covenant with the Jewish people. The transformation of Catholic teaching about Judaism after the Holocaust represents one of the most significant theological shifts in church history. Before the war, Catholic catechisms and sermons routinely depicted Jews as collectively responsible for Christ's death and spiritually blind for rejecting him as Messiah. Good Friday liturgies included prayers for the perfidious Jews. Catholic publications frequently employed anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. After the war, progressive Catholic theologians like the French philosopher Jacques Maritain argued that such teaching had helped create the cultural conditions that made the Holocaust possible. Over the next 2 decades, a theological revolution occurred within Catholicism, culminating in the Second Vatican Council's declaration that Jews cannot be held collectively responsible for Christ's death, that God's covenant with the Jewish people remains valid, and that anti-Semitism is incompatible with authentic Christianity. Pope John Paul II would later describe anti-Semitism as a sin against God and humanity, and establish diplomatic relations with Israel. This transformation, from a theology that denigrated Judaism to one that affirmed its ongoing spiritual validity, represents the Church's most profound response to its Holocaust failures. The post-war experiences of Catholic clergy revealed the divergent paths taken during the Nazi era. Some priests who had collaborated with the Nazis faced ecclesiastical discipline or criminal charges, though many escaped serious consequences. Priests who had been imprisoned in concentration camps often returned to their communities as moral authorities whose suffering gave weight to their teaching. In Eastern Europe, many Catholic clergy who had survived Nazi persecution now faced communist oppression, moving directly from one form of resistance to another. The Cold War quickly overshadowed the Church's Holocaust reckoning, with anti-communism again becoming the dominant framework for Catholic social engagement. This ideological continuity, from anti-communist collaboration with fascism to Cold War opposition to Soviet expansion, allowed many Catholics to avoid confronting their institution's moral failures during the Nazi era. The Church's positioning as a bulwark against communism helped rehabilitate its moral authority in the West, while postponing a full accounting of its Holocaust complicity until decades later. The legacy of the Church's divided response to Nazism continues to shape Catholic identity today. For institutional leaders, it offers sobering lessons about the dangers of privileging the Church's political interests over its prophetic mission. For theologians, it demonstrates how traditional religious teachings can be distorted to support evil when not grounded in fundamental respect for human dignity. For ordinary believers, it raises challenging questions about the moral demands of faith when religious and political authorities conflict. The Catholic Church that emerged from World War II was both diminished and purified, its moral credibility damaged by institutional compromise, yet renewed by the witness of Catholic martyrs and rescuers who had recognized Christ in the persecuted. This dual heritage, of both moral failure and extraordinary courage, continues to shape Catholicism's understanding of its role in confronting modern atrocities and injustices. The priests who prayed for Hitler and those who died defying him represent the perennial choice facing believers in every age, whether to accommodate evil in the name of institutional survival or to risk everything in faithful witness to the gospel's demands. Their divergent paths remind us that religious institutions, even those claiming divine guidance, remain human organizations capable of both magnificent courage and catastrophic moral failure. The divided Catholic response to Nazism offers profound lessons for contemporary religious institutions facing moral challenges. First, it reveals the danger of privileging institutional self-preservation over ethical witness. When church leaders prioritized diplomatic relations with the Nazi regime, protection of Catholic schools, or preservation of church property over speaking clearly against genocide, they betrayed their tradition's central moral commitments. Second, it demonstrates how nationalism can corrupt religious identity, transforming universal faith into a tribal marker. Many Catholic clergy allowed their German, Croatian, or Slovak identity to override their commitment to universal human dignity, illustrating religion's vulnerability to nationalist co-option. Third, the Nazi era exposed the inadequacy of religious institutions focused primarily on personal piety rather than social ethics. Catholics who faithfully attended Mass, received sacraments and observed traditional devotions often remained passive before the systematic destruction of their Jewish neighbors, suggesting that conventional religious practice without critical moral formation can coexist with complicity in atrocity. Finally, this history highlights the prophetic potential of religious faith when practiced with moral courage. The Catholic rescuers who hid Jews, the priests who spoke against Nazi racism, and the theologians who articulated alternative visions all drew inspiration from the same gospel that their compromised leaders professed, proving that authentic religious witness can thrive even when institutional leadership fails. This divided legacy continues to shape Catholic engagement with contemporary human rights issues. When Pope John Paul II apologized in 2000 for the Church's historical sins, including those committed in service of the truth through intolerance and religious violence, he explicitly acknowledged the Holocaust as requiring special repentance. This institutional examination of conscience has led to greater Catholic emphasis on religious freedom, interreligious dialogue, and human rights advocacy. Vatican II reforms transformed Catholic teaching on Judaism, religious liberty, and church-state relations, directly addressing theological weaknesses revealed during the Nazi era. Today's Catholic social teaching emphasizes solidarity with the marginalized, the primacy of conscience, and respect for human dignity in ways that reflect lessons learned from Holocaust complicity. Contemporary Catholic leaders like Pope Francis have more consistently prioritized moral witness over institutional advantage, criticizing unjust economic systems, environmental degradation, and mistreatment of migrants, even when such stances create political tension. Yet the temptation to compromise with powerful but immoral regimes remains. Recent Catholic accommodation to authoritarian governments in countries like Hungary, where church leaders have supported Viktor Orban's illiberal policies in exchange for financial support and cultural prominence, suggests that the lessons of the Nazi era require continuous relearning. For religious believers of all traditions, the story of Catholic clergy under Nazism offers both warning and inspiration. It warns against the seductive power of nationalism to override religious ethical commitments, the danger of theological anti-Semitism and other forms of religious prejudice, and the inadequacy of privatized faith detached from social responsibility. It inspires through examples of extraordinary moral courage, from hidden acts of mercy by parish priests who forged baptismal certificates to save Jewish lives, to public resistance by figures like Bernhard Lichtenberg, who prayed openly for persecuted Jews until his arrest. This history demonstrates that religious institutions, despite their claims to moral authority, remain human organizations vulnerable to compromise, cowardice, and corruption. Yet it also reveals that authentic faith can inspire remarkable courage even in history's darkest moments. The ultimate lesson may be that religious truth is validated not by institutional pronouncements or theological sophistication, but by concrete actions that protect human dignity when it is most threatened. By this measure, the true church during the Nazi era existed not primarily in Vatican diplomacy or episcopal statements, but in concentration camp barracks where imprisoned priests shared their last bread, in convents where nuns hid Jewish children, and in ordinary parishes where believers followed conscience rather than conformity. The contemporary church's understanding of its Holocaust-era failures has profoundly influenced its approach to historical memory and reconciliation. Pope Benedict XVI, visiting Auschwitz in 2006, asked, "Where was God in those days? Why was he silent? How could he permit this endless slaughter, this triumph of evil?" These questions acknowledge that the Holocaust represents not just a political crime, but a theological challenge requiring ongoing reflection rather than easy answers. The Catholic Church has established formal dialogues with Jewish communities, incorporated Holocaust education into seminary formation, and repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. In 2015, the Vatican document, "The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable," explicitly rejected missionary efforts targeting Jews, acknowledging Judaism as a valid covenant relationship with God, a remarkable reversal from pre-Holocaust Catholic triumphalism. These developments suggest that institutional religions can learn from their moral failures and undergo genuine ethical evolution. Yet the Church still struggles with full accountability, as evidenced by controversies surrounding the potential canonization of Pius Thuarthin and ongoing debates about Vatican complicity in post-war escape networks for Nazi criminals. This incomplete reckoning reflects the difficulty of balancing institutional loyalty with honest historical assessment, a challenge faced by all organizations with complex moral legacies. The priests who prayed for Hitler and those who died defying him represent opposing responses to what theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the boundary situation, moments when conventional religious practice and institutional loyalty become inadequate guides for moral action. In such moments, believers must choose between comfortable complicity and costly witness, between institutional security and prophetic integrity. Though the Holocaust represents a unique historical atrocity, similar boundary situations continue to confront religious communities today, whether in responding to sexual abuse within religious institutions, confronting climate change that threatens global well-being, addressing economic systems that perpetuate poverty, or opposing nationalist movements that target vulnerable minorities. The divided Catholic response to Nazism reminds contemporary believers that religious institutions, even those claiming divine foundation, remain human organizations capable of profound moral failure. It suggests that authentic faith often requires critical distance from religious authorities and openness to the prophetic voices marginalized within tradition. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that true religious fidelity sometimes demands resistance to religious leadership itself, that in boundary situations where institutional religion compromises with evil, genuine faith may be better preserved by those labeled disobedient than by those who maintain comfortable conformity. The priests of Dachau, through their suffering witness, may ultimately have preserved authentic Catholicism more faithfully than the bishops who accommodated Nazi rule in hopes of institutional survival, a paradoxical truth that challenges all religious communities to reconsider the relationship between institutional loyalty and moral integrity.